They thought Margaret was just a sweet old grandmother who spent her days knitting scarves and baking cookies. They had no idea she was sitting on a business empire worth millions. When her daughter-in-law told her to quote her age at a family dinner, Margaret decided it was time to show them exactly what acting her age really meant. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Margaret Chen Williams had always been good at blending into the background. At 72, she moved through her son David's sprawling Boulder home like a gentle breeze, present but unremarkable. The house sat on 3 acres of pristine Colorado landscape, with the Flatirons rising majestically in the distance. Most mornings, she'd sit on the wraparound porch with her coffee, watching the sun paint the mountains gold while David and his wife Jessica rushed through their morning routines. The arrangement had started 18 months ago, shortly after Margaret's husband Charles passed away. David had insisted she shouldn't live alone in the family ranch house in Steamboat Springs. "Mom, you're getting older," he'd said with that gentle but firm tone adult children use when they think they know best. Besides, Emma needs her grandmother around. Emma was their 8-year-old daughter, a bright spark who reminded Margaret of herself at that age, curious, determined, and far too smart for her own good. Jessica had smiled and nodded when David suggested his mother move in. "Of course," she'd said, though Margaret caught the slight tightness around her eyes. "We have plenty of space." And they did. The modern farmhouse was magnificent, with its open floor plan, chef's kitchen, and floor-to-ceiling windows that brought the Colorado outdoors inside. Jessica worked as a marketing director for a tech startup in Denver, while David managed investments for high-net-worth clients at a prestigious firm. They were successful, polished, and busy. Margaret settled into the guest suite on the main floor, a comfortable space with its own bathroom and a small sitting area. She kept her belongings minimal: some photographs, her favorite books, a few pieces of jewelry that held memories. The rest of her things remained in storage or back at the ranch house, which she decided to keep for now. She told herself she was just visiting, helping out, being useful. In those early weeks, she threw herself into the role of helpful grandmother. She picked up Emma from school when Jessica's meetings ran late. She prepared elaborate dinners that filled the house with the sense of her childhood, her grandmother's pot roast recipe, homemade bread that took all day to rise properly, soups that simmered for hours. She learned Jessica's preferences: organic vegetables, free-range everything, minimal salt, no processed foods. Margaret adapted without complaint. She organized Emma's playroom, alphabetizing the books and sorting the art supplies into labeled containers. She weeded Jessica's herb garden, carefully researching which plants needed what kind of care. She even learned to operate the complicated coffee machine that Jessica had brought back from Italy, mastering the precise timing required for the perfect espresso. Margaret found genuine joy in these small contributions. When Emma bounded off the school bus with stories about her day, Margaret listened with the patience that comes from having lived long enough to know how precious these moments are. She helped with homework, taught Emma to braid friendship bracelets, and shared stories about David's childhood that made the little girl giggle. But somewhere between the helpful gestures and quiet presence, Margaret began to fade. Not physically, she was still strong, still sharp, still capable of hiking the trails around Boulder Lake when she found the time. She faded in the way that older people sometimes do in busy households, becoming part of the landscape rather than part of the conversation. Dinner conversations flowed around her. David and Jessica discussed work projects, Emma's school events, weekend plans with friends Margaret had never met. They talked about renovating the kitchen, planning a vacation to Costa Rica, investing in a mountain bike for Emma. Margaret nodded and smiled, offering the occasional comment, but mostly she listened. She told herself it was natural. They were building their life together, and she was just a visitor in it. Jessica began making small adjustments to the household routine. She replaced Margaret's favorite coffee with an organic fair trade blend that tasted like cardboard. She rearranged the spice cabinet according to some system Margaret couldn't decipher. She installed a new thermostat that required an engineering degree to operate, then showed Margaret how to use it exactly once, speaking slowly as if Margaret might not understand. "I just think it's more efficient this way," Jessica would say when she moved things around, "and better for the environment." Margaret never argued. She'd lived through enough changes in her 72 years to know that adaptation was easier than resistance. The comments started small. "Oh, Margaret, those jeans are so vintage," Jessica said one morning when Margaret appeared in her favorite Levi's, the ones that had softened to perfection over decades of wear. "Maybe we should go shopping together sometime. Find you some more age-appropriate options." Margaret looked down at her jeans, suddenly self-conscious. They were comfortable, practical, broken in just right. But Jessica's words planted a seed of doubt. At Emma's soccer game, Jessica introduced Margaret to the other parents as David's sweet mother who's staying with us. The word staying hung in the air like a question mark. Margaret noticed how Jessica positioned herself slightly in front of her, as if Margaret were somehow embarrassing or needed to be managed. When Margaret offered to drive Emma to her friend's birthday party, Jessica hesitated. "Are you sure you're comfortable driving in Denver traffic? It's gotten so crazy lately." Margaret had been driving for over 50 years without incident, but she found herself nodding. "You're probably right. The roads are different now." The adjustments accumulated like dust in corners, nearly invisible individually but somehow dimming everything. Margaret's morning coffee routine moved to earlier and earlier hours to avoid the kitchen rush. Her evening reading moved from the living room to her bedroom to give the family space. Her suggestions for dinner were gently redirected toward lighter options or something quicker. She began to feel like a guest who had overstayed her welcome, except she had never set an end date for her visit. The ranch house in Steamboat Springs sat empty, waiting for her to decide what came next. But every time she considered going back, David would mention how much Emma loved having her around, or Jessica would comment on how helpful it was to have an extra pair of hands. Margaret found herself shrinking to fit the space they seemed comfortable giving her. She spoke less at dinner. She asked fewer questions about their day. She made herself useful in ways that wouldn't interfere with their rhythm. She became the person they seemed to want her to be: quiet, helpful, grateful, and ultimately forgettable. But beneath the surface, Margaret remained who she had always been. She read the financial news every morning, keeping track of market movements and investment trends with the sharp attention of someone who understood exactly what those numbers meant. She managed her own portfolio through discreet phone calls to her longtime advisor, making decisions that would have impressed David if he'd known about them. She stayed connected to business contacts through carefully timed emails and occasional video calls when the house was empty. The woman who had built something extraordinary from nothing was still there, underneath the cardigan and sensible shoes. She was just waiting for the right moment to remind everyone, including herself, exactly who Margaret Chen Williams really was. That moment was coming sooner than anyone expected. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Winter arrived early in Boulder that year, blanketing the Flatirons in pristine snow and turning the mountain air sharp and crystalline. Margaret watched the first significant snowfall from her bedroom window, remembering how she used to love storms like this at the ranch. Charles would build fires that crackled all evening while she worked on quarterly reports at the kitchen table, snow swirling outside their windows like nature's own screensaver. But here in David's house, winter meant different rhythms. Jessica cranked up the heating system to tropical levels, complaining about the dry air while running 3 humidifiers that made the house sound like a spa. The fireplace remained decorative. Jessica worried about air quality and carpet stains. Margaret found herself layering sweaters in her own room, preferring the crisp cold to the artificial warmth that made her feel drowsy and unfocused. The holidays approached with military precision. Jessica had already ordered custom Christmas cards in October, scheduled the family photos for November, and created color-coded spreadsheets for gift-giving that would have impressed a Fortune 500 logistics manager. Margaret offered to help with the cooking, mentioning her famous prime rib recipe that had been requested at every family gathering for 30 years. "Oh, that's so sweet, Margaret," Jessica replied, not looking up from her laptop screen where she was researching organic, locally sourced menu options. But I've already hired a caterer. We're doing a plant-forward celebration this year. Much better for everyone's health and honestly less stressful for all of us. She smiled brightly. Though maybe you could make some of your cookies for Emma? Nothing too elaborate, of course. Margaret nodded and retreated to her room, where she sat for a long moment staring at the recipe cards her own mother had passed down to her. Recipes written in faded pencil, stained with decades of use, each one a small piece of family history. She slipped them back into their wooden box, next to other mementos from her past life. The catered holiday meal arrived in sleek black containers, arranged on biodegradable plates that cost more than Margaret's weekly grocery budget at the ranch. The food was beautiful, artfully arranged vegetables, quinoa salads dotted with pomegranate seeds, desserts that looked like small sculptures. But it tasted like expensive cardboard, lacking the soul that comes from hands that have cooked with love for decades. Emma pushed the food around her plate, clearly unimpressed. "Grandma Maggie," she whispered when Jessica went to answer a work call, "can you make your chocolate chip cookies later? The ones with the crispy edges?" Margaret glanced toward the kitchen, where Jessica was gesticulating animatedly at her phone. "We'll see, sweetheart. Maybe when your mom's not busy." But busy seemed to be Jessica's permanent state. She had joined 3 neighborhood committees, signed up for a wine club that required monthly tastings, and enrolled in a pottery class that met every Tuesday evening. Her calendar was a rainbow of color-coded appointments that left little room for spontaneity or, Margaret noticed, genuine family time. David had grown quieter as winter deepened. His investment firm was navigating a complex merger, and he often worked until 10 or 11 at night, coming home to find Margaret reading in the living room while Jessica caught up on her shows with noise-canceling headphones. He'd nod tiredly at his mother, grab a beer from the refrigerator, and disappear into his home office to review more reports. Margaret began to feel like she was watching her family's life through glass. Present but separate, included but not essential. She tried to bridge the gap by learning about Jessica's interests, researching sustainable living practices, and asking thoughtful questions about the pottery class. But Jessica's responses were polite and brief, delivered with the same tone she might use with a friendly but persistent salesperson. "It's really more about mindfulness and creative expression," Jessica explained when Margaret asked about a particularly lopsided bowl Jessica had brought home from class. "I'm not sure it's something your generation would really understand. No offense." None taken, Margaret thought, but didn't say. She had spent 40 years understanding complex market dynamics, negotiating deals that required reading people's motivations like tea leaves, and building something substantial from nothing. But apparently, ceramic bowls were beyond her comprehension. The breaking point began to form around Emma's school project. The 3rd graders were assigned to interview an elderly family member about the olden days. Emma bounced into Margaret's room with her tablet and a list of questions her teacher had provided. "Grandma Maggie, I get to interview you. Tell me about when you were little. Did you have electricity? Did you ride horses to school?" Emma's eyes sparkled with the kind of curiosity that made Margaret's heart sing. They spent an entire afternoon together, Emma recording Margaret's stories about growing up on her family's small farm outside Pueblo, working summers at her uncle's hardware store, and being one of only 3 women in her business classes at the University of Colorado. Margaret carefully edited her stories, focusing on childhood adventures rather than her later accomplishments. She sensed that Jessica might not appreciate tales of boardroom victories and million-dollar deals. Emma was enchanted. "You were so brave, Grandma Maggie. Tell me more about your job." "Well," Margaret began carefully, "I worked with numbers and helped people make good decisions about money. Like a teacher? Something like that, sweetheart." When Emma presented her project to the class, she called her grandmother the smartest person I know, and described her as someone who, quote, helped lots of people and lived through really important history. The teacher was impressed enough to send a note home praising Emma's thorough research and Margaret's engaging storytelling. Jessica read the note while standing at the kitchen counter, her expression shifting from pleasant to something Margaret couldn't quite identify. "That's nice that Emma enjoyed talking with you," she said finally. though I hope you didn't fill her head with too many dramatic stories. Kids her age can't always tell the difference between reality and, well, embellishment." The word hung in the air like smoke. Embellishment. As if Margaret's life had been a fairy tale rather than a carefully built reality. "I only told her true stories," Margaret said quietly. "Of course," Jessica replied, but her tone suggested otherwise. "It's just that sometimes older people remember things differently than they actually happened. Memory can be flexible." Margaret felt something cold settle in her chest. She had been accused of many things in her life, being too ambitious, too direct, too unwilling to accept limitations. But she had never been accused of being a liar or living in fantasies. That evening she called her longtime friend, Patricia Morrison, who lived in Aspen and was one of the few people who truly knew Margaret's history. They had started their businesses in the same era, supporting each other through challenges that younger women couldn't imagine. "Pat," Margaret said after they'd caught up on family news, "do you think I've changed? Do I seem different than I used to be?" Patricia's laugh was warm and familiar. "Maggie, you sound exactly like yourself. Why? Is someone making you feel like you're not?" Margaret found herself explaining the small erosions, the casual dismissals, the way her own family seemed to see her as a pleasant but unremarkable elderly woman whose opinions carried no weight. "You know what your problem is?" Patricia said after listening carefully. "You're being too nice. You're letting them rewrite who you are because it's easier than reminding them. But honey, you didn't build what you built by being invisible." After the call, Margaret sat in her room looking through the window at the snow-covered mountains. Patricia was right. She had become a supporting character in her own story, allowing others to define her limitations rather than asserting her capabilities. But change was coming. Margaret could feel it building like the pressure before a storm, and she knew that soon her family would discover exactly who they were living with. The question was whether they would be ready for the truth. Spring arrived in Boulder with the kind of dramatic flair that only Colorado could deliver. One day the mountains were shrouded in snow, and the next, wildflowers were pushing through the earth with determined optimism. Margaret had always loved this season at the ranch, the way the land seemed to exhale after winter's long hold, the promise of new beginnings carried on warm winds. But in David's house, spring meant Jessica's latest project, a complete landscape redesign. She had hired a team of consultants who spoke in phrases like sustainable xeriscaping and native plant integration. They descended on the property with clipboards and soil samples, treating the existing garden, which Margaret had quietly tended for months, as if it were a crime scene requiring immediate intervention. "We're thinking drought-resistant grasses and indigenous wildflower meadows," Jessica explained to Margaret while pointing at architectural drawings that looked more like abstract art, much more environmentally conscious than the current setup. Margaret nodded, watching through the window as workers uprooted the herb garden she had carefully cultivated. The basil plants she had babied through winter's indoor growing season were tossed into a disposal bin, along with the rosemary bushes that had finally started to thrive in Colorado's challenging soil. "What about the herbs?" Margaret asked. "I could transplant them somewhere else if you'd like." Jessica waved a dismissive hand. "Oh, those old things were probably full of pesticides anyway. We're starting fresh with certified organic plants. Much safer for Emma." The herbs Margaret had grown were organic. She had meticulously composted their soil and used only natural pest deterrents her grandmother had taught her. But correcting Jessica seemed pointless. Margaret was learning that facts were less important than Jessica's version of reality. The landscaping project consumed Jessica's attention for weeks. She posted daily updates on social media, documenting the transformation with carefully curated photos that emphasized sustainability and design innovation. Margaret noticed she was never included in these posts, despite being visible in several of the background shots. Jessica had apparently mastered the art of photographing around her. During this time, Margaret began receiving phone calls that she took privately in her room or during her morning walks around the neighborhood. Her longtime business associate, Roberto Valdez, was reaching out more frequently about opportunities that required her insight. A sustainable energy company in Denver was interested in her perspective on their expansion plans. A tech startup developing financial software wanted her to review their business model. Margaret, Your track record with emerging markets is exactly what they need, Roberto explained during one call. You understand both the technical and human elements of scaling businesses. That's rare. Margaret listened from her bedroom, speaking in hushed tones to avoid disturbing the household routine. She found herself energized by these conversations in ways that folding laundry and arranging flowers never achieved. Her mind, which had been idling like a luxury car stuck in traffic, suddenly had room to accelerate. But when she mentioned to David that she was considering consulting work, his reaction was immediate and uncomfortable. "Mom, you're retired," he said, looking up from his laptop with the kind of concerned expression usually reserved for elderly relatives showing signs of confusion. "You don't need to work anymore. Just enjoy this time." "I'm not talking about needing to work," Margaret clarified. "I'm talking about wanting to contribute. There are companies that could benefit from my experience." David's smile was patient but patronizing. "I think it's great that you want to stay busy. Maybe you could volunteer at the library or help with Emma's school fundraiser. Something more appropriate for where you are in life, where she was in life." As if being 72 meant her brain had suddenly become decorative rather than functional. Margaret let the subject drop, but the conversation crystallized something that had been bothering her for months. Her family didn't just see her as elderly, they saw her as obsolete. They had constructed an image of her as a sweet grandmother, whose greatest accomplishments were behind her, whose opinions were charmingly outdated, whose capabilities were limited to domestic tasks. This perception became more obvious as Jessica's social circle expanded. She had joined a book club that met monthly at the house, rotating hosting duties among the members. Margaret typically retreated to her room during these gatherings, but sometimes she lingered in the kitchen, preparing refreshments and listening to fragments of conversation. The women in Jessica's book club were accomplished professionals: a pediatric surgeon, a federal judge, an environmental lawyer who argued cases before the Supreme Court. They discussed complex topics with sophistication and passion. Margaret found their conversations fascinating, remembering similar discussions from her own professional days. During one gathering, they were debating a book about women breaking barriers in male-dominated industries. Margaret, who was arranging cheese and crackers in the kitchen, couldn't help but smile at some of their observations. They were describing experiences she knew intimately: the careful navigation of boardrooms where every word was scrutinized, the challenge of being taken seriously while maintaining femininity, the exhaustion of proving competence daily. "The author makes such important points about generational differences," one woman was saying. "Our mother's generation really had so few opportunities. They just accepted limitations that we would never tolerate." Margaret paused in her preparation, a sharp observation forming on her tongue. But before she could speak, Jessica's voice cut through the room. "Oh, that's Margaret, David's mother," she said, noticing that one of the women had glanced toward the kitchen. "She's staying with us. Sweet lady, very traditional. She's from that generation that prioritized family over careers." The assumption stung more than Margaret expected. She had prioritized family, but not instead of career, in addition to it. She had worked twice as hard as her male colleagues, while raising David as a single mother, after her first husband died in a construction accident. She had built something extraordinary, while never missing a school play or soccer game. But in Jessica's narrative, Margaret was simply traditional, a euphemism that seemed to mean limited or old-fashioned. Margaret finished arranging the refreshments and quietly left the food on the kitchen island, retreating to her room as the women continued their discussion about women's professional achievements. She sat on her bed, surrounded by silence, and realized she felt more invisible than she had since her husband's funeral. That night, she called Patricia again. "I think I'm disappearing," Margaret admitted. "Not physically, but everything that makes me who I am. They see me as this generic elderly woman, and I'm starting to believe them." Patricia was quiet for a moment. "Maggie, do you remember when you bought that first apartment building in Vale? Everyone said you were crazy. A single mother with no construction experience trying to renovate a building that most contractors wouldn't touch." Margaret smiled slightly. "I remember you thought I was crazy too." "I absolutely did, but you proved us all wrong. You saw potential where others saw problems. You trusted your instincts even when everyone doubted you." Patricia's voice grew firm. That woman didn't disappear just because she put on a cardigan and moved to Boulder. She's still there. The question is whether you're going to let her stay hidden. After the call, Margaret sat in the dark, looking out at the mountains. Patricia was right. She had spent so much energy trying to fit into the space her family had created for her that she had forgotten the space she used to occupy in the world. Tomorrow would bring another day of small dismissals and casual assumptions. But something had shifted in Margaret during that conversation. The woman who had built an empire from instinct and determination was starting to remember exactly what she was capable of. And she was beginning to think it might be time to remind everyone else. The first week of June brought an unexpected visitor to Boulder. Emma's other grandmother, Jessica's mother, Nancy Hamilton, arrived from Phoenix with her boyfriend Ronald, a retirement community cruise director who treated every conversation like a shore excursion announcement. They planned to stay for 10 days, and Jessica transformed into a different version of herself, more animated, more controlling, more determined to showcase the perfect life she had curated. Margaret watched this transformation with fascination. Jessica deep-cleaned rooms that were already spotless, hired a meal service to supplement her usual organic groceries, and created an itinerary for her mother that read like a luxury vacation brochure. Every detail was orchestrated to demonstrate success, sophistication, and domestic harmony. "Mother will be staying in the master guest suite upstairs," Jessica informed Margaret 3 days before Nancy's arrival. "I hope you don't mind, but it has the better view and the larger bathroom. You know how she is about comfort." Margaret didn't mind. Her current room was perfectly adequate, but she noticed how Jessica framed it as an accommodation rather than a simple room assignment. As if Margaret's preferences were obstacles to be navigated rather than considerations to be respected. Nancy Hamilton arrived in a whirlwind of expensive luggage and emphatic opinions. She was 68, blonde in a way that required monthly maintenance, and carried herself with the confidence of someone who had never questioned her place in any room. Ronald followed behind her like an enthusiastic golden retriever, commenting loudly on the house's architectural features and the magnificence of the Colorado landscape. "Jessica, darling, this place is absolutely stunning," Nancy announced, sweeping through the front door in designer athleisure wear that probably cost more than Margaret's monthly budget at the ranch. "And the mountains. Ronald, didn't I tell you the mountains would be spectacular?" Ronald nodded vigorously while taking photos with an iPad he held at arm's length like a shield. "Spectacular, Nancy. Absolutely spectacular. This will look amazing on our Facebook." Margaret was introduced as David's mother who's been staying with us, a description that somehow made 18 months sound like a weekend visit. Nancy smiled politely and shook Margaret's hand with the kind of firm grip that suggested she had learned this gesture in a business seminar decades ago. "How lovely," Nancy said, her eyes already scanning past Margaret toward more interesting elements of the house. "Jessica has told me so much about you." Margaret doubted this was true since Jessica rarely mentioned her to anyone, but she smiled and offered to help with the luggage. Nancy waved her away with manicured fingers. "Oh no, dear, Ronald has it handled. We travel with everything we need." The next few days revealed the complex dynamics of Jessica's relationship with her mother. Nancy had retired from a successful career in pharmaceutical sales, and her stories dominated every conversation. She had sold medications to hospitals across the Southwest, earned multiple sales awards, and traveled extensively for work. Ronald chimed in with supportive commentary and photographic evidence stored on his ever-present iPad. Margaret found herself relegated to an even more peripheral role during their visit. Meals became performances where Nancy recounted her professional triumphs, while Jessica nodded with eager approval. David contributed when prompted but seemed overwhelmed by the conversational energy. Emma, clearly uncomfortable with the attention and noise, spent more time in her room or found excuses to play outside. "Margaret," Nancy said on their third evening after several glasses of wine had made her more expansive, "Jessica tells me you've been such a help around the house. It's so nice when grandmothers can contribute in practical ways." The word practical landed with the same dismissive weight as traditional had during the book club gathering. Margaret was being categorized, filed away as useful but unremarkable. "I try to help where I can," Margaret replied quietly. "Oh, I'm sure you do," Nancy continued, warming to her theme. "It's wonderful that you have time for domestic things. I was always too busy with work to focus on housekeeping. My career required constant travel, constant networking. But now that I'm retired, I appreciate women who found fulfillment in simpler pursuits. Simpler pursuits. Margaret felt something tighten in her chest, a familiar anger that she had spent months suppressing. Nancy was making assumptions based on nothing more than Margaret's current circumstances, creating a hierarchy where professional achievement trumped everything else. "What kind of work did you do before retirement, Margaret?" Ronald asked, apparently sensing an opportunity to gather more biographical information for his mental database. Margaret hesitated, glancing around the table. David was checking his phone. Jessica was refilling wine glasses. Emma was drawing pictures on her napkin. No one seemed particularly interested in her answer. "I worked in business," Margaret said simply. "How nice," Nancy replied with the kind of enthusiasm people reserve for children's art projects. "Small business is so important to communities. What kind of shop did you have?" The assumption stung. Margaret had operated on a scale that Nancy, despite her pharmaceutical sales success, had never approached. But correcting the misunderstanding felt petty and defensive. "Investment management," Margaret clarified. Nancy nodded absently, already moving on to describe a cruise she and Ronald were planning for the fall. Margaret's answer had been filed away as unimportant, another piece of harmless elderly woman trivia. That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. She walked through the quiet house, ending up in the kitchen where moonlight streamed through the large windows. She made tea and sat at the island, surrounded by the expensive appliances and designer fixtures that represented Jessica's version of success. Her phone buzzed softly, a text message from Roberto about a potential consulting opportunity with a renewable energy consortium. They were looking for someone with her background to advise on market entry strategies for emerging technologies. The project would involve traveling to Denver for meetings, potentially expanding to other markets, and working with a team of executives who valued her expertise. Margaret stared at the message for a long time. Just 6 months ago, she would have jumped at this opportunity. Her mind was still sharp, her insights still valuable, her experience still relevant. But sitting in this kitchen, having spent the evening being dismissed as someone whose greatest contribution was washing dishes and folding laundry, she felt disconnected from the woman who had once commanded boardrooms and negotiated million-dollar deals. She started to type a polite decline, then stopped. Patricia's words echoed in her memory. That woman didn't disappear just because she put on a cardigan and moved to Boulder. Instead, Margaret typed back, "Send me the details. I'm interested." The next morning brought the incident that would change everything. Nancy had decided she wanted to visit the Pearl Street Mall, Boulder's famous pedestrian shopping area. Jessica planned the outing with military precision, parking strategies, restaurant reservations, a list of stores that would appeal to Nancy's aesthetic preferences. "Margaret, you should come with us," Jessica said, while organizing her purse with the efficiency of a surgical nurse. "It would be good for you to get out of the house." The phrasing irritated Margaret, as if she were a shut-in who needed encouragement to venture into the world. But she agreed. She enjoyed Pearl Street's energy and thought the outing might provide opportunities for a real conversation away from the house's performative atmosphere. They drove to Boulder in Jessica's pristine SUV, Nancy commenting extensively on the scenery while Ronald documented everything with his iPad. Margaret sat in the back seat, watching the landscape she had come to love roll past the windows. Pearl Street was bustling with summer visitors, street performers, and locals enjoying the warm weather. They browsed shops filled with Colorado-themed merchandise, artisanal jewelry, and outdoor gear that cost more than most people's mortgage payments. Nancy bought extensively, gifts for friends in Phoenix, souvenirs for herself, items she declared absolutely perfect before forgetting about them 10 minutes later. At one boutique specializing in women's clothing, Nancy held up a flowing scarf covered in bright geometric patterns. "This would be perfect for you, Margaret," she announced. "Very age-appropriate. Mature women need to embrace color instead of hiding in boring neutrals." Margaret looked down at her outfit, dark jeans and a sage green sweater that she had always considered elegant and flattering. Suddenly, under Nancy's scrutiny, she felt dowdy and invisible. That's thoughtful, Margaret replied, not wanting to create a scene. Oh, and look at these. Nancy continued, pulling cardigans from a rack with enthusiasm that seemed designed for an audience. These would be perfect for you. Very grandmotherly, very comfortable. You could wear them to Emma's school events. Very grandmotherly. The words settled over Margaret like a shroud, reducing her to a stereotype rather than acknowledging her as an individual with her own sense of style and preference. Jessica nodded approvingly. Those are cute, Margaret. Much more suited to your lifestyle than some of the things you've been wearing. Margaret felt something crack inside her chest. Her lifestyle apparently required costumes that announced her irrelevance to the world. She was being dressed for the role they had written for her harmless grandmother, who shuffled through life in comfortable shoes and apologetic smiles. But the final blow came during lunch at an upscale restaurant Jessica had chosen to impress her mother. They were seated at a table with a view of the Flatirons, menus full of locally sourced ingredients and prices that reflected Boulder's affluent demographics. Nancy ordered wine and began regaling them with stories about her retirement activities, her bridge club, her investment portfolio, the condo she was considering in Scottsdale. She spoke with the confidence of someone whose opinions carried weight, whose experiences mattered, whose future held endless possibilities. The key to successful retirement, Nancy proclaimed, is staying relevant. I've joined 3 boards, I'm consulting for my former company, and I'm even considering writing a book about women in sales. You have to keep growing, keep contributing, keep proving your worth. Margaret listened, recognizing the irony. Nancy was describing exactly the kind of engagement Margaret craved, the kind of continued relevance that David and Jessica seemed determined to deny her. That's amazing, Mother, Jessica said with genuine admiration. You're such an inspiration. Nancy beamed, then turned to Margaret with a smile that dripped with condescension. Of course, not everyone has that kind of energy at our age. Some people prefer quieter activities. There's nothing wrong with acting your age, dear. Act your age. The words hung in the air like a challenge, carrying all the assumptions and dismissals that had been accumulating for months. Margaret felt every slight, every casual dismissal, every reduction of her identity converging into this moment. Nancy continued talking, but Margaret heard nothing beyond those 4 words. Act your age. As if her age automatically limited her capabilities, her interests, her right to remain engaged with the world. Margaret smiled quietly and excused herself to use the restroom. But instead of heading to the bathroom, she walked outside into the Colorado sunshine and made a phone call that would change everything. Roberto, she said when he answered, I want to discuss that consulting opportunity, and I think it's time people learned exactly what acting my age really looks like. Margaret returned to the restaurant table with a composure that surprised even herself. Nancy was still holding court, describing her upcoming Mediterranean cruise with the kind of detail usually reserved for historical documentaries. Jessica hung on every word while David scrolled through his phone, occasionally making supportive sounds at appropriate intervals. Sorry, Margaret said quietly as she slid back into her seat. Business call. Nancy paused mid-sentence, her perfectly shaped eyebrows rising slightly. Business call? How interesting. The word dripped with the same condescension as practical and traditional. Margaret simply smiled and reached for her water glass, saying nothing more. Let them wonder. The remainder of lunch passed in a blur of Nancy's monologues and Jessica's enthusiastic responses. Margaret contributed only when directly addressed, her mind occupied with the conversation she'd just had with Roberto. The Renewable Energy Consortium needed someone with her specific background in emerging market investment strategies. The timeline was aggressive. They wanted to begin consulting sessions within 2 weeks, with the potential for ongoing collaboration through the fall. Perfect, she had told Roberto. Send me everything. Back at the house, Margaret retreated to her room while Nancy and Ronald settled in for afternoon naps. Jessica busied herself preparing an elaborate dinner designed to showcase her culinary sophistication. Margaret could hear her moving through the kitchen with purposeful efficiency, the sounds of chopping, sizzling, and timer setting creating a domestic symphony. Margaret opened her laptop and began reading through the documents Roberto had already sent. The consortium consisted of 6 companies developing different aspects of renewable energy technology: solar panel manufacturing, wind farm development, battery storage systems, and grid integration software. They needed strategic guidance on market penetration in Mountain West states, particularly Colorado, Utah, and Montana. As Margaret read through their business plans and financial projections, she felt muscles in her mind that had been dormant for months beginning to stretch and flex. These were sophisticated operations with solid fundamentals but limited understanding of regional market dynamics. They needed someone who understood both the technical aspects of energy infrastructure and the political complexities of environmental regulations in conservative Western states. She made notes in margins, identified potential challenges they hadn't considered, and began formulating questions that would help her understand their true capabilities versus their ambitious projections. This was work she could sink her teeth into: complex, meaningful, financially significant. Her phone rang. "Patricia." "Maggie, I just got off the phone with Roberto Valdez. He says you're coming back to work?" Margaret smiled, realizing how good it felt to hear someone sound excited about her professional prospects rather than concerned about her age-appropriate activities. "Consulting?" Margaret clarified. "Renewable energy market strategy. It's exactly the kind of project I used to love." "That's wonderful." Patricia's enthusiasm was genuine. "When do you start?" "Next week. Initial meetings are in Denver, but the work could expand significantly if we're successful." "We?" Margaret paused, realizing what she had said. "I meant if I'm successful." "No," Patricia said thoughtfully. "I think you meant we. You're already thinking like part of their team. That's the Margaret the First, remember? The one who never took on a project she didn't intend to own completely." After they hung up, Margaret sat quietly in her room, listening to the sounds of the house around her. Jessica was still cooking, occasionally calling out instructions to David about wine selection or table settings. Nancy and Ronald's voices drifted down from upstairs, apparently reviewing the day's photographs on Ronald's iPad. Emma was practicing violin in the basement, the tentative notes of a beginning student filtering through the floors. It was a pleasant domestic scene, the kind of family harmony that looked perfect from the outside. But Margaret felt no connection to it. She was a supporting character in other people's story, appreciated for her usefulness, but not valued for her contributions. That evening at dinner, Nancy dominated the conversation as usual, but Margaret found herself studying the family dynamics with analytical detachment. She watched Jessica perform perfection: the flawless meal presentation, the careful wine pairings, the strategic questions designed to showcase Nancy's accomplishments. She observed David's quiet exhaustion, the way he participated in conversations without actually engaging. She noticed Emma's restlessness, how the 8-year-old fidgeted and daydreamed while the adults talked around her rather than to her. "Margaret," Nancy said suddenly, interrupting Margaret's observations, "you've been so quiet tonight. Are you feeling all right?" "I'm fine," Margaret replied. "Just thinking." "About what, dear?" Margaret considered her answer carefully. "About how people change as they get older. How they either expand into new possibilities or contract into smaller versions of themselves." Nancy's smile became slightly fixed. "That's very philosophical. Though I suppose at our age philosophy is about all we have left." The comment was designed to be dismissive, to reduce Margaret's observation to the harmless musings of an elderly woman with too much time on her hands. But something in Margaret's expression must have suggested that this particular elderly woman was thinking about more than abstract concepts. "Actually," Margaret said quietly, "I've been thinking about work." David looked up from his plate with concern. "Mom, we've talked about this. You don't need to work anymore." "Need and want are different things," Margaret replied. "I've been offered a consulting position with a consortium of renewable energy companies. The work starts next week." The silence that followed was electric. Jessica's fork paused halfway to her mouth. David set down his wine glass with careful precision. Nancy's eyes sharpened with interest, but not the supportive kind. Consulting? Jessica's voice carried a note of skepticism. What kind of consulting? Investment strategy and market analysis for emerging energy technologies. Nancy laughed, a sound like crystal breaking. Oh, Margaret, that sounds very impressive. But don't you think those kinds of positions require rather specialized expertise? Technical knowledge that takes years to develop? Margaret met Nancy's gaze steadily. Yes, they do. Well, Nancy continued, apparently not catching the implication, I'm sure they need administrative support or customer service representatives. Those can be very fulfilling positions for people our age. The assumption was breathtaking in its arrogance. Nancy had automatically concluded that Margaret's involvement would be clerical rather than strategic, supportive rather than leadership-oriented. Actually, Margaret said, her voice growing quieter rather than louder, they need someone to lead their market expansion strategy. Someone with experience in emerging market analysis, regulatory navigation, and large-scale investment management. David was shaking his head. Mom, I think you might be misunderstanding what they're offering. These companies probably get a lot of older people applying for positions they're not qualified for. I'm not applying for anything, Margaret said. They approached me. Who approached you? Jessica asked, her tone suggesting she suspected some kind of scam targeting vulnerable elderly people. Roberto Valdez from Valdez Strategic Consulting. We've worked together for 25 years. Nancy's expression shifted slightly, recognizing the name from business circles, but she recovered quickly. Well, I suppose some companies do offer honorary consulting positions to retirees. It's very kind of them to help you feel useful. Honorary. The word crystallized everything Margaret had been feeling for months. In Nancy's world, Margaret's involvement could only be ceremonial. A charitable gesture to make an old woman feel important rather than a genuine recognition of valuable expertise. Margaret excused herself from dinner and returned to her room, where she spent the evening reviewing the consortium's materials with renewed focus. She identified 3 critical market opportunities they had overlooked and developed preliminary frameworks for addressing regulatory challenges in each target state. By midnight, she had created a presentation outline that would demonstrate exactly why they had sought her expertise. The next morning, while the rest of the house was still sleeping, Margaret called Roberto to schedule an in-person meeting in Denver. Then she opened her closet and selected clothes she hadn't worn in months. A tailored blazer, professional slacks, the kind of shoes that announced competence rather than comfort. She was done being dismissed. Done being patronized. Done being treated like a decoration in her own life. Pado, Margaret Chen Williams was going back to work, and her family was about to discover that acting her age meant something entirely different than they had imagined. Margaret left the house at 7:30 on Monday morning, dressed in a charcoal gray suit that transformed her from invisible grandmother into someone who clearly belonged in boardrooms. She had told Jessica she was going to Denver for the day, but offered no additional details. Jessica, busy coordinating Nancy's itinerary for a spa day in Boulder, barely looked up from her phone. Drive carefully, Jessica said absently. Denver traffic can be overwhelming for people who aren't used to it. Margaret simply nodded and walked to her car, a pristine silver BMW sedan that had been sitting in the garage for months, barely used since she'd moved to Boulder. David had suggested she might be more comfortable with something smaller, easier to park, more appropriate for someone her age. But Margaret had kept the BMW for reasons she was only now beginning to understand. The drive to Denver felt like awakening from a long sleep. Margaret had forgotten the pleasure of driving with purpose, of having somewhere important to be. The highway curved through the foothills, revealing glimpses of red rock formations and expansive sky that made her remember why she had fallen in love with Colorado decades ago. The Renewable Energy Consortium had offices in the Denver Tech Center, a gleaming complex of glass and steel that housed some of the state's most innovative companies. Margaret pulled into the executive parking area, adjusted her blazer, and checked her reflection in the rearview mirror. The woman looking back at her bore little resemblance to the apologetic figure who had been folding laundry and arranging flowers for the past 18 months. Roberto Valdez was waiting in the lobby, and his smile when he saw her was everything Margaret had missed about professional recognition. Warm, respectful, and genuinely pleased to see her. "Margaret," he said, embracing her with the easy familiarity of old colleagues. "You look absolutely fantastic. Ready to remind everyone why you're the best strategic mind I know?" "Let's find out," Margaret replied, feeling confidence settle around her like a familiar coat. The consortium's conference room was filled with 6 executives, each representing a different aspect of renewable energy development. They were younger than Margaret. Most appeared to be in their 40s or early 50s, but their introductions revealed impressive credentials and substantial experience in their respective fields. "Ms. Chen Williams," said Dr. Sarah Chen, no relation despite the shared surname, who headed the solar manufacturing division. "Roberto has told us about your track record with emerging market penetration. We're particularly interested in your analysis of regulatory environments in conservative Western states." For the next 3 hours, Margaret found herself in her element. She reviewed their expansion plans with the kind of detailed attention that had made her legendary in investment circles. She identified regulatory hurdles they hadn't considered, suggested strategic partnerships that could accelerate market acceptance, and proposed financing structures that would minimize risk while maximizing growth potential. "Your Utah market analysis needs fundamental revision," Margaret said, pulling up demographic data on her laptop and projecting it onto the conference room screen. "You're treating it like a typical conservative state, but Utah has unique factors that actually favor renewable energy adoption. The LDS Church's emphasis on environmental stewardship, combined with the state's tech sector growth, creates opportunities you're completely missing." The room was silent for a moment as the executives absorbed her analysis. Then Dr. Chen leaned forward with genuine interest. "Can you elaborate on that? Our research suggested Utah would be one of our most challenging markets." Margaret spent 20 minutes explaining the cultural and economic factors that made Utah potentially their strongest expansion opportunity, backing up every assertion with data she had researched the night before. When she finished, the consortium's CEO, Michael Torres, was taking notes. "This is exactly the kind of insight we need," he said. "You're seeing patterns our younger analysts missed entirely." The phrase "younger analysts" hung in the air, and Margaret realized that her age, rather than being a liability, was actually an advantage. She had witnessed market cycles, regulatory changes, and technological disruptions that gave her perspective these brilliant but inexperienced executives lacked. "I'd like to propose a more comprehensive engagement than we initially discussed," Dr. Chen said as the meeting concluded. "Would you be interested in leading our entire Western expansion strategy? It would involve significant travel, board presentations, and direct client interaction." Margaret felt a surge of excitement she hadn't experienced in years. "I'm very interested." "Excellent. We're talking about a 6-month initial contract with the potential for long-term engagement. The compensation would reflect the senior strategic role, $15,000 per month plus equity participation and full expenses." Margaret managed to keep her expression neutral, but internally she was calculating. $15,000 per month was more than she had been spending annually on personal expenses while living at David's house. The equity participation could be worth significantly more if the consortium succeeded. "When would you like to start?" she asked. "Immediately," Michael Torres replied. "We have a board presentation next Friday in San Francisco. Could you be ready to present your Utah analysis along with preliminary strategies for Colorado and Montana?" "I'll be ready." Margaret left the Denver office with a folder full of proprietary documents, a new company laptop, and a sense of purpose that made her feel 20 years younger. She had forgotten the intoxicating rush of being valued for her mind, sought after for her expertise, treated as an essential contributor rather than a pleasant accessory. The drive back to Boulder gave her time to process what had just occurred. In 3 hours, she had reminded herself, and proven to others, that Margaret Chen Williams was far from obsolete. The consortium wasn't offering her charity work or age-appropriate activities. They were offering her a leadership position in a multi-million-dollar expansion strategy. She arrived home to find Nancy, Jessica, and Ronald arranged around the kitchen island, reviewing photographs from their spa day. They looked up when Margaret entered, their expressions shifting from casual interest to surprise, as they took in her professional attire. "Margaret," Nancy said, her voice carrying a note of confusion, "you look very formal. How was your day in Denver?" "Productive," Margaret replied, setting her new briefcase on the counter next to Nancy's souvenir shopping bags. "I start work next week." Jessica's brow furrowed. "Start work? I thought you were just exploring some volunteer opportunities." "No," Margaret said quietly. "I'm leading the Western expansion strategy for a renewable energy consortium. 6 companies, multi-state market penetration, equity participation." The silence that followed was different from the previous evening's skeptical quiet. This silence carried weight, confusion, and the beginning of recognition that something fundamental had shifted. Ronald, ever eager to fill conversational gaps, spoke first. "That sounds very important, Margaret. What exactly does that involve?" Margaret looked around the kitchen, at the 3 faces staring at her with varying degrees of bewilderment. For months, she had tried to explain herself in terms they would understand, downplaying her capabilities to fit their expectations. But standing here in her business suit, fresh from a meeting where her expertise had been recognized and valued, she felt no need to minimize anything. "It involves analyzing market opportunities for renewable energy technologies across Colorado, Utah, and Montana," she said matter-of-factly. "Developing regulatory compliance strategies, identifying strategic partnerships, and presenting recommendations to boards of directors. The initial contract is 6 months at $15,000 per month, with potential for long-term engagement." Nancy's wineglass paused halfway to her lips. "$15,000 per month? Plus equity participation and expenses," Margaret added. "I'll be traveling to San Francisco next Friday for the first board presentation." Jessica was shaking her head slowly, as if trying to process information that didn't fit her understanding of reality. "Margaret, are you sure you understand what they're asking you to do? That sounds like a very senior position." "It is a very senior position," Margaret replied. "That's why they sought me out." But Jessica struggled to find words that wouldn't sound insulting. "I mean, no offense, but that kind of work usually requires very specific qualifications and experience." Margaret set down her briefcase and turned to face Jessica directly. "You're absolutely right. It does require specific qualifications and experience." The implication hung in the air like smoke from a fire no one had noticed building. Nancy set down her wineglass with careful precision, her expression shifting from confusion to something approaching alarm. "Margaret," she said slowly, "what exactly did you do before retirement?" For the first time in months, Margaret smiled with genuine amusement. They were finally asking the right question. "I built and sold 3 companies," she said simply. "The largest one was worth $47 million when I sold it to a Fortune 500 energy corporation in 2019. Before that, I spent 30 years developing investment strategies for emerging markets, specializing in regulatory navigation and large-scale infrastructure projects." The silence that followed wasn't just quiet, it was profound, echoing with the sound of assumptions crashing down around them. Margaret picked up her briefcase and headed toward her room. "I'll be working late tonight preparing for Friday's presentation. Good evening." Behind her, she heard Nancy's voice, smaller and less certain than it had been all week. "Jessica, did you know about any of this?" Margaret closed her bedroom door and opened her laptop. She had work to do, and for the first time in 18 months, that felt exactly where she belonged. The house felt different the next morning. Margaret could sense it the moment she stepped into the kitchen for her usual early coffee. The air carried a tension that hadn't been there before, thick with unspoken questions and scrambled assumptions. She had slept better than she had in months, her mind energized by the work ahead and the satisfaction of finally being seen clearly. Jessica was already at the kitchen island, laptop open, but her usual morning efficiency was absent. She kept glancing up from her screen toward Margaret, as if expecting the woman who had made dinner quietly for 18 months to suddenly sprout wings or speak in foreign languages. "Good morning," Margaret said pleasantly, proceeding with her normal routine of starting the coffee maker and retrieving her favorite mug from the cabinet. "Morning," Jessica replied, her voice careful and uncertain. She seemed to be studying Margaret's movements, searching for clues that would explain how she had so fundamentally misunderstood the woman living in her house. Nancy appeared in the kitchen doorway wearing an expensive silk robe and an expression of barely contained curiosity. She had clearly been waiting for Margaret to emerge from her room, ready to continue the conversation that had ended so abruptly the night before. "Margaret, good morning," Nancy said with forced brightness. "I hope you slept well. I imagine you have a lot on your mind with this new opportunity." The word opportunity carried weight, as if Nancy was still hoping this might turn out to be some kind of misunderstanding or exaggeration, rather than the reality that had shattered her carefully constructed assumptions. "I slept very well, thank you," Margaret replied, pouring her coffee with the same measured calm she had once used in negotiations where millions of dollars hung in the balance. "I have a productive day ahead." Ronald wandered into the kitchen in his travel-worn pajamas, apparently unaware of the undercurrents swirling around him. "Good morning, ladies. Beautiful Colorado morning, isn't it? Perfect for sightseeing." Nancy shot him a look that could have flashed frozen coffee. This was not the morning for Ronald's cheerful tourism commentary. "Actually," Nancy said, settling onto a bar stool with theatrical casualness, "I was hoping Margaret might tell us more about her business background. I found myself quite curious after our conversation last night." Margaret recognized the tone. It was the same one Nancy had used when questioning Emma about her homework or discussing Jessica's career achievements. Probing, evaluative, designed to establish Nancy's position as the knowledgeable authority seeking to understand lesser accomplishments. "What would you like to know?" Margaret asked simply. "Well," Nancy began, clearly having prepared this conversation, "when you mentioned building companies, I was wondering what scale we're talking about. You know, employee count, revenue, that sort of thing." Jessica looked up from her laptop, and Margaret realized this interrogation had been coordinated. They had discussed Margaret's revelations after she'd gone to bed, probably analyzing every word, trying to determine how much was true and how much was elderly embellishment. Margaret sipped her coffee slowly, considering her response. She could provide the details they were fishing for, the employee counts, revenue figures, acquisition details, and industry recognition that would prove her credibility. But something about their prosecutorial approach irritated her. They weren't asking out of genuine interest in her life. They were fact-checking her worthiness. "My largest company employed 340 people across 6 states when I sold it," Margaret said matter-of-factly. "Annual revenue was approximately $23 million. The acquisition price was $47 million, as I mentioned yesterday." Nancy's expression flickered almost imperceptibly. Those were numbers that demanded respect, regardless of who had achieved them. "And what kind of business was it?" Jessica asked, her fingers hovering over her laptop keyboard, as if she was planning to verify Margaret's claims through Google searches. "Infrastructure development consulting," Margaret replied. "We specialized in regulatory navigation and market analysis for energy and transportation projects. My team advised on everything from wind farm placement to pipeline routing to grid modernization initiatives." Ronald, who had been pouring coffee with his usual oblivious cheerfulness, suddenly stopped moving. "Pipeline routing, like oil and gas pipelines?" "Among other things," Margaret confirmed. Nancy leaned forward slightly. "That sounds like very technical work. How did you get into that field?" The question carried an implication that Margaret heard clearly. "How does someone like you, someone we assumed was simple and traditional, end up in such a sophisticated industry?" "I started as a research analyst for an environmental consulting firm in the 1980s, Margaret explained. This was just as the energy industry was beginning to grapple with environmental regulations in earnest. I discovered I had a talent for understanding both the technical requirements and the political dynamics involved in large-scale infrastructure projects." "Political dynamics?" Jessica's eyebrows rose. "Energy infrastructure is intensely political," Margaret said. "Every pipeline, every wind farm, every transmission line requires navigating federal, state, and local regulations, plus community concerns, environmental impact assessments, and stakeholder negotiations. Success requires understanding engineering, law, politics, and human psychology." Nancy was quiet for a moment, processing this information. Margaret could see her recalibrating, trying to reconcile this description with the woman she had been patronizing for the past week. That does sound complex, Nancy admitted carefully. And you did this for 30 years? I built my first company in 1987, Margaret said. Sold it in 1995. Built the second in 1996. Sold it in 2003. The third I ran until 2019 when Charles started having health issues, and I wanted to focus on his care. The timeline was clear and devastating to every assumption they had made about her. While Nancy was selling pharmaceuticals and Jessica was building her marketing career, Margaret had been creating and operating multi-million-dollar enterprises in one of the most challenging industries in America. David chose that moment to appear in the kitchen, still in his workout clothes, clearly unaware of the conversation taking place. "Morning, everyone," he said, heading directly for the coffee maker. "Mom, did you have a good day in Denver yesterday?" The question hung in the air. Everyone in the kitchen turned to look at Margaret, waiting to see how she would summarize her return to professional life for her son. "Very good," Margaret said simply. "I accepted a position leading Western expansion strategy for a renewable energy consortium. I'll be traveling to San Francisco on Friday for my first board presentation." David froze with his coffee mug halfway to his lips. "Board presentation?" "To the consortium's board of directors," Margaret clarified. "They want me to present market analysis and strategic recommendations for expanding into Utah, Colorado, and Montana." David set down his mug with careful precision, the same movement Jessica had made when processing unexpected information. "Mom, are you sure you understand what they're asking you to do? Board presentations are usually very high level, very technical." Margaret felt a familiar flash of irritation. Even after everything that had been revealed, her own son still couldn't quite believe she was capable of sophisticated professional work. "David," she said quietly, "I presented to boards of directors for over 30 years. I've addressed congressional subcommittees, testified before state regulatory commissions, and negotiated with Fortune 100 executives. Friday's presentation will not be my first." The silence that followed was profound. David was staring at his mother as if seeing her for the first time, which, Margaret realized, he essentially was. "Congressional subcommittees," he said weakly. "Energy policy and environmental regulations," Margaret confirmed. "I testified 6 times between 1995 and 2018, usually regarding the economic impact of proposed legislation on infrastructure development." Nancy made a small sound that might have been a suppressed gasp. Congressional testimony was the kind of credential that couldn't be dismissed or minimized. It represented a level of expertise and recognition that placed Margaret in an entirely different category than any of them had imagined. Jessica was shaking her head slowly. "Margaret, why didn't you ever mention any of this? In 18 months you never said anything about having this kind of background." "You never asked," Margaret replied simply. "And when I tried to discuss working or contributing professionally, you redirected me toward volunteer activities that would be more appropriate for where I am in life." The phrase landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples of recognition through the room. They had all participated in defining Margaret's limitations, in deciding what was appropriate for someone her age, in assuming that her past was less significant than their presence. "But you let us think," Jessica began, then stopped, apparently realizing there was no way to finish that sentence without acknowledging their own prejudices. "I let you think what you chose to think," Margaret said gently. "I tried to fit into the space you seemed comfortable giving me. But I've realized that trying to become smaller to make others comfortable is a betrayal of everything I worked to build." Margaret finished her coffee and rinsed her mug in the sink, aware that 4 pairs of eyes were tracking her every movement. The woman they had dismissed as a simple grandmother was revealing herself to be someone none of them had bothered to know. "If you'll excuse me," she said, "I have work to do. The renewable energy sector waits for no one, regardless of their age." As she headed toward her room, Margaret heard Nancy's voice behind her, much quieter than usual. "Jessica, what exactly do we know about your mother-in-law?" Margaret smiled as she closed her bedroom door. Finally, they were asking the right questions. It was just 20 years too late. 3 weeks later, Margaret stood in her new corner office on the 32nd floor of a Denver high-rise, looking out at the Rocky Mountains stretching endlessly toward the horizon. The view was spectacular, but what made her smile was the nameplate on her door, Margaret Chen Williams, Senior Strategic Advisor. Below it, in smaller text, Western Expansion Initiative. The San Francisco presentation had been a triumph. The consortium's board had not only approved her Utah strategy but had expanded her role to include oversight of all Western market development. Her contract had been extended to 2 years, with a substantial raise and equity package that would, if the company succeeded, make her wealthier than she had ever been. "Margaret?" Dr. Sarah Chen appeared in her doorway, holding a tablet and wearing the kind of excited expression that usually preceded good news. "The Utah Regulatory Commission just approved our solar farm proposal, all 15 sites. They said your community engagement strategy was the most comprehensive they'd ever seen." Margaret felt a familiar surge of satisfaction. The Utah project had required months of careful relationship building with local leaders, environmental groups, and business communities. She had personally attended dozens of town halls, explaining how renewable energy development could create jobs while preserving the landscape values that made these communities special. "That's excellent news," Margaret replied. "What's our timeline for groundbreaking?" 6 months, Sarah said. "And Margaret, there's something else. The governor's office called. They want you to head up a state task force on renewable energy workforce development. It's a gubernatorial appointment." Margaret leaned back in her chair, processing this information. A gubernatorial appointment would make her one of the most influential voices in Colorado's energy policy. At 72, she was being asked to shape the future of an entire industry. "I'll need to think about it," she said, though her mind was already racing through the possibilities. After Sarah left, Margaret turned back to the mountain view and thought about the conversation she'd had with Emma the previous weekend. Her granddaughter had called to report that she was doing a follow-up project about her grandmother for school. "Grandma Maggie," Emma had said, her voice bubbling with excitement over the phone, "my teacher wants me to interview you about your work. She says you're probably the most accomplished person any of us knows." Margaret had laughed, remembering how Jessica had once worried about Emma's head being filled with dramatic stories. "What do you want to know, sweetheart?" "Everything. How did you become so important? How did you learn to be the boss of so many people? And why didn't Mom and Dad know?" That last question had given Margaret pause. Why hadn't they known? The answer was complex, involving assumptions about age and gender, the invisibility that society imposes on older women, and her own choice to minimize herself in order to fit into their lives. "Sometimes," Margaret had told Emma carefully, "people forget that grown-ups have whole lives before they become parents and grandparents. Your mom and dad love me, but they were so busy with their own lives that they forgot to ask about mine." "That's silly," Emma had declared with the absolute certainty of an 8-year-old. "I always want to know about people's lives." The conversation had reminded Margaret of something important. This wasn't just about her family's assumptions. It was about the broader tendency to reduce older people to their current roles rather than honoring their complete histories. Her phone buzzed with a text from David. "Mom, could we have dinner tonight? Just the 3 of us? We need to talk." Margaret smiled and typed back, "Of course. I'll make reservations somewhere nice." That evening, Margaret arrived at the restaurant first, having chosen a place in downtown Boulder known for its sophisticated atmosphere and excellent wine list. She was wearing a navy blue dress and the pearl necklace Charles had given her for their 20th anniversary. Elegant but not ostentatious. Professional but warm. David and Jessica arrived together, both looking nervous in the way that adults do when they know they need to have a difficult conversation. They had clearly spent time preparing, probably discussing what they wanted to say and how to say it. "Mom," David began after they'd ordered wine, "we owe you an apology. A big one." Margaret studied her son's face, seeing genuine regret but also confusion, as if he was still trying to understand how their family dynamics had become so distorted. "Go on," she said gently. Jessica cleared her throat. Margaret, I realize now that I made assumptions about you that were completely wrong. I treated you like you were just a generic older woman instead of someone with your own accomplishments and identity. We both did, David added. I think somewhere along the way I started seeing you as my mom who needed taking care of, instead of Margaret Chen Williams who happened to be my mother. Margaret appreciated their honesty, but she was curious about what had prompted this particular conversation. What made you realize this? David and Jessica exchanged glances, and Jessica spoke first. Your friend Patricia called me yesterday. She wanted to make sure we understood what you'd given up when you moved in with us. Margaret raised an eyebrow. Patricia had not mentioned any such phone call. She told us about the ranch house in Steamboat Springs, David continued. About how you'd been planning to turn it into a retreat center for women entrepreneurs. About the consulting offers you'd been declining to help with Emma and the house. Margaret felt a wave of affection for Patricia, who had apparently decided that her friend's family needed education about what they had taken for granted. She also mentioned, Jessica said quietly, that you've been paying for Emma's violin lessons and dance classes for the past year, and that you covered the property taxes on our house last winter when David's bonus was delayed. Margaret had done these things quietly, without fanfare or expectation of recognition. But she was realizing that her attempts to be helpful without being burdensome had instead made her contributions invisible. Patricia was rather direct about our shortcomings, David said with a rueful smile. She said we'd been treating you like live-in help instead of like family. That's not entirely fair, Margaret replied. You never treated me poorly. You just didn't see me completely. But that's the problem, isn't it? Jessica asked. We saw what we expected to see, instead of who you actually are. The conversation continued over dinner, with David and Jessica asking questions they should have asked 18 months earlier. They wanted to know about her businesses, her congressional testimony, her plans for the future. They listened with the kind of attention they had never given her domestic observations or gentle suggestions. So what happens now? David asked as they finished dessert. Are you planning to move out? Margaret considered the question. She had been thinking about her living situation since accepting the consulting position. Her work required travel and long hours, and she needed space that felt like her own rather than borrowed. I think it's time, she said. I'm looking at condos in downtown Denver, something close to the office with a view of the mountains. She saw disappointment flicker across David's face, but also understanding. Will you still be part of Emma's life? Jessica asked. She adores you, and honestly, I think she's learned more from you in the past month than from anyone else. Margaret smiled. Of course, but maybe our relationship can be more intentional now, less about convenience and more about genuine connection. As they walked to their cars after dinner, David caught Margaret's arm gently. Mom, he said, I'm proud of you. I should have said that years ago, but I'm proud of everything you've accomplished, and I'm sorry it took us so long to really see you. Margaret kissed her son's cheek. You see me now. That's what matters. Driving home through Boulder's quiet streets, Margaret thought about the changes that had unfolded since Nancy's casual comment about acting her age. She had indeed acted her age. She had stepped back into the professional identity she had earned through decades of hard work. She had refused to accept limitations imposed by others' expectations rather than her own capabilities. The house was quiet when she arrived, Nancy and Ronald having departed for Phoenix the day after Margaret's revelation, their visit cut short by what Nancy described as urgent business matters, but which everyone understood to be profound embarrassment. Margaret went to her room and opened her laptop to review presentations for the next day's client meetings. At 72, she was working harder than she had in years, and she had never been happier. Her phone buzzed with a text from Emma. Grandma Maggie, I told everyone at school about your job and they think you're super cool. Can you come to Career Day and tell us about being a boss? Margaret typed back, I would love to. Let's plan it. As she prepared for bed, Margaret caught sight of herself in the dresser mirror. The woman looking back at her was the same one who had arrived at David's house 18 months earlier. But everything else had changed. She was no longer trying to fit into a space designed by others' assumptions. She was creating her own space, one that honored both her age and her accomplishments. Acting her age, Margaret had discovered, didn't mean becoming smaller or quieter or more apologetic. It meant claiming the wisdom, confidence, and capability that 7 decades of living had given her. And at 72, Margaret Shen Williams was just getting started. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us. Gorgeous.